An excerpt of the life of Lucius Veld by David Nelson. Read by the author. The stone ceiling of the room was always moist, whether it was raining or not. Tonight, though, it was particularly bad. The thunder had been rolling, shaking the chains on the floor and frightening away the rats. Lucius rubbed the back of his neck, the roughly forged chain grating against his abdomen as he reached up. He flicked his fingers away and watched as a few drops of ice-cold water arced into a puddle in the corner of the room. 1, 2, 3. 3 months. For 3 months he'd been sitting in this room. The bars up on the northern wall were too high to look through, but they allowed light to peek through, illuminating the southern wall and part of the floor during the day. Today, however, the storm clouds cover the sun, so the only thing the window's good for is letting the rain in. Lucius gingerly scooted backward towards the western wall, where his chains are bolted, pressing himself up against the cold masonry. Footsteps on the stairs ring out, echoing about the small cell, reflecting off the metal cot, and finally being absorbed by the emaciated Lucius, who scrunched up even smaller, wrapping his arms around his knees as he bunches up. He peered over his arm, gazing with his ink-black eyes out into the shadow beyond the bars of the east wall of the cell. He can see. The leather-studded boots thud down onto the damp ground, spraying water droplets against the wall. Lucius's eyes track up the stocky frame of the familiar body, tracing the fur-lined trousers, the leather belt, lingering on the belted short sword on the hip, then flicking over the double-layered dark green tabard. The man, Dane, cocked a flame-red eyebrow and brushed his dripping, shoulder-length hair out of his face.
"Behaving yourself down here, are you, rat?"
The larger man trundled up to the bars, leaning his forearms against them and looking down at Lucius. The bag of coins on his hip jingled. Lucius stayed silent. Receiving no response to his goading, Dane snorted and spat a wad of phlegm at the curled form. Lucius pulled his foot out of the way just before the mucus would have splattered on him. He ducked his head and glared into his arm.
"Oi, you, quit that!"
came the exasperated command from the man at the bars.
"You know the rules. No magic's being used in here. Mr. Nord's whip will have its way with you."
Lucius's head popped up and looked down at his arms to see that dark black spikes had begun to protrude from his forearms, glistening wickedly in the low light. He sighed and closed his black eyes. No change. The spikes were mostly about 5 centimeters in length now, and growing.
"Lucius, cut it out, you slimy cur. I'll flog you."
Lucius glared up at Dane, then shifted to sit with his back to the wall, and extended his arms out in front of his chest and gritted his teeth, squinting angrily at his out-of-control transformation. 7 centimeters.
"Right,"
bellowed the bigger man, fumbling behind his back for his keys, his stubby arms barely reaching around his girthy stomach.
"You know the rules, kid. If you don't get rid of them nasty spikes by the time I get to you, you'll be regretting it."
A rumble started deep in Lucius's emaciated chest as he strained to get rid of them nasty spikes. After a moment, the clunk of the lock caused Lucius's eyes to flick up to the gate and see the red-haired monster coming to rend flesh from bone. The scraping of the bars being pulled across the stone was almost drowned out completely by Lucius's screaming. The sound echoed out of the small stone room, causing the other teens in nearby buildings to look up at their barred windows, high on the walls, and sniff back their fear. The fire is going out. It's too cold to let that happen. Plus, the fire keeps the creatures away, thought Lucius. Setting his dagger and whetstone down next to the rock he'd been sitting on, he stood and stretched his arms, flicking them outward so his elbows would pop. The fire popped and flickered. Lucius looked around his clearing. Besides the fire, his sitting rock, and his small tent and rucksack, there wasn't much to take in. Of course, there wasn't any firewood worth anything in immediate reach. Lucius sighed and shook his left foot, which had fallen asleep in the time he'd been lost in thought, sharpening his dagger. He slowly traipsed into the tree line, his black eyes scanning the shadowed ground, seeing the branches, dead leaves, and mosses in clear relief as if it were daytime. He glanced ahead, watching as small rodents, amphibians, and insects skittered back into the holes in the ground or fallen trees while he approached. He pressed his thin lips together and resumed his scan of the forest floor for usable wood. It's too much to suppress all of the time. It's like they can smell it on me. The shadow. It. The creatures can feel them within me. Oh, there's a good log. Few of them, actually. Nice. Distracted from his reflection, Lucius bent to pick up the logs, taking a few moments to figure out how to best arrange the 6 wood cylinders in his arms without tearing his robes. As he stacked them all, the one on top teetered and tumbled to the ground, bouncing once before it stopped. Lucius looked down and cleared his throat. His voice scratchy from disuse, he croaked out, "Pick it back up." Moments later, the log on the ground lifted from where it fell and moved to rest back on top of the stack of logs. In fact, carry these," Lucius commanded and extended his arms, then moments later released the pile of wood which remained suspended in the air. "Follow me." Lucius, followed by a floating pile of logs, made the short trek back to the clearing, stepping over thorn runners and small fruit-bearing bushes as he maneuvered through the flora. A few meters before the edge of the clearing, Lucius glanced up and noticed that the glow from the clearing was a lot brighter than it had been when he left, which is, of course, not how campfires usually work. Suspicious, Lucius suddenly stopped, causing the stack of logs behind him to clatter into his back, pushing him forward a bit and making a clunking noise. He threw a glare over his shoulder at the logs, then rolled his eyes, knowing nothing would come of it. Lucius looked forward again in time to see movement around the campfire, and the gleam of what may have been a small sword, likely steel by the way it reflected the fire's light. "Drop, slowly," the black-robed man whispered over his shoulder. The logs lowered to the ground and quietly clattered as they settled. Matching their descent, Lucius slowly crouched and raised the hood of his robes. His hand gently caressed the sheath at his hip, and then stopped suddenly. My dagger still sitting next to the fire. Frack. No weapons. He's got weapons. Or she. Who knows? A stick at the edge of the clearing near Lucius snapped. A burly figure, likely just shorter than 2 meters in height and likely over 100 kilograms, crouched at the source of the sound, peering through the underbrush, a scimitar in his hand. Slowly, when he looked left, Lucius crept through the dense plant life around the backside of the campsite, slowly moving away from the large man and approaching him from behind. If I can get the jump on him, maybe I can incapacitate him or something and get him to tell me where he's from and what he's doing out in the middle of these woods. I thought I was far enough out that nobody would happen upon me. There's no way he's looking for me, right? His eyes flickered frantically around the woods as he processed. What if he is? What if Nord sent him? No, there's no way. It's been 2 years. I'm not 17 anymore. He can't do anything to me. Lucius neared the back end of the clearing and saw that the stranger had ventured a few feet into the woods and was looking intently in the tree line, moving logs and large-leafed ferns. The darkness was still thick over the forest, so while Lucius could still see perfectly, the man was probably near blind that far from the fire. Why would Nord even want me back? I was a failed experiment. A freak, he and Dane had called me. A monster. A monster. He emerged quietly from the tree line and crouched behind the tarp that made up his tent. Peering around the edge of the oiled fabric, he glanced for a moment at the fire and noticed that it was back at full strength, having new logs added. A few more logs were tied to the outside of an unfamiliar rust-brown backpack that was leaning up against the rock, which explained where they came from. Notably, his dagger was no longer by the rock. It was probably taken by the stranger. First smart thing he's done. My other dagger's in my rucksack, which is inside the tent, but I'll be totally exposed, I think. He moved around the back end of the tent to the other side, where he could still be blocked by the fabric. Lucius crouched to the back corner and slightly lifted the edge, feeling blindly into the tent with his right hand for his rucksack. He successfully hooked the edge of the strap with his finger and pulled it slightly closer to him so he could find the dagger inside. Where is that skagging thing? He could be back any second. Stab me in the back. Then we'll all die. Wouldn't that be great?
No, not great.
Not now, Buggy.
Sorry, Lucius, I'm sorry.
Ah, there's the dagger. He pulled his hand free from the tent, holding the sheathed dagger in his hand. Lucius peered around the edge of the tent. For a moment he couldn't see the big man, but then the large form stood upright a few feet into the woods and looked around in a circle as if he had heard something. He looked back down and kicked something that made a clattering sound. Ah, he found the pile of wood. Now he knows for sure that someone is around, not just an animal. The man bent down and tried to pick up the wood, but his chubby arms couldn't bend enough to hold all of the logs at once, so he dropped them in annoyance. He pulled his belt, a leather strip free from his belt loops, and looped it around the bundle of wood. As he threaded the end through the buckle, Lucius grimaced from behind the tent flap. Frack, this isn't ideal. The stranger pulled the strap down tight, securing the logs, then hoisted them onto his back and began marching back to the campfire.
Buggy dropped the dagger onto the ground and nudged it back under the edge of the tent with his bare foot, then scrambled over to the rock by the fire and began removing the wood from the stranger's bag and stacking it neatly by the rock-ringed fire pit. "We have a guest! Got to make it look nice," he muttered happily to himself. After stacking all the wood by the fire, he reached over and grabbed the redstone that was still lying by the rock where he had left it, and loped over to the tent, dropping it on the pack. He turned around and froze. The large man, wood slung over his shoulder, was standing over the fire, staring in shock at the skeletal, balding figure that was staring across the clearing at him. The bigger man let the strap slip between his fingers, sending the wood clattering to the floor and causing the small figure to jump back and look back and forth between the logs and the stranger. The man spoke, his deep voice tentative.
Hello, fair creature. Are you okay?
Buggy shifted his left foot backwards toward the perceived safety of the tent and gazed intently at the ground. Yes, Buggy is okay. Thank you, mister. How are you? The corner of the man's eyes crinkled, but his mouth's expression didn't change. He glanced down at the now dwindling fire, grabbing one of the logs that Buggy had stacked and laid it gently onto the pyre. Buggy's eyes flicked to the scimitar tucked into the man's back strap, its curved butterfly blade sticking out just behind his hips.
Don't you worry about this, small friend. This is only for hunting.
The man did smile at this, but his eyes didn't crinkle this time.
What is your name?
They call me Buggy, the hunched figure replied, then shuffled forward slightly, ducking his head as he approached.
Well, it's nice to meet you, Buggy. Thank you for letting me share your fire, even if I did show up unannounced. I'm sorry for frightening you. My name is Malik.
Buggy nodded and scooted a little closer. Do you have any foods? Malik smiled slightly and pulled some jerky out of his backpack and handed it to Buggy, then tossed another log on the fire. 2 left. Buggy accepted the jerky and tore at it with his remaining teeth, crouching next to the fire. As he made very vocal chewing noises, he stared at the flames as they licked the ashen logs. Malik stared down at the smaller man, watching him silently with curious eyes.
How long have you been living out here, Buggy?
He asked, offering another strip of jerky. We have lived out here for a few weeks, I think. Why are you in the woods, mister? Malik's head popped up and scanned the tree line. Then he quickly inquired.
We? Are there more people living here?
Buggy calmly grabbed the last 2 logs and placed them into the fire. No, not more people, mister. Why are you in the woods? Malik's head lowered a bit, and he looked closely at Buggy. His hand dropped to his sword's pommel. He didn't respond. Buggy looked up at him, but then, meeting his eyes, he dropped his gaze and shuffled backwards a bit. No problem. Sorry. Any more jerky?
No,
the man replied, slowly standing.
I'm looking for someone out here, Buggy, and I was wondering if you had seen him. He's a skinny young man, about 1.5 meters, and has long, greasy black hair.
Buggy blinked at the ground and took another step backward, then cleared his throat and looked up at the trees and approaching dawn. No, I haven't seen any person like that before. Not out here. There's nobody in this part of the woods but us, I thinks. What did he do bad? Malik straightened his shoulders and looked down at the fire, thinking a moment before he replied.
He's wanted dead or alive by his hometown's magistrate, suspected in the murder of a local apprenticeship home warden. It's been a while since it happened, but new evidence was discovered and the boy was never found.
Buggy stared up at the burly man, his eyes wide with terror as he asked, "Oh no, that sounds really bad. Is he dangerous?" Malik was startled out of his fire-gazing by the question, and bent to get another piece of firewood. Finding that there were none left in the pile Buggy had made, he stepped over to the bundle he had carried out of the woods.
I'm not sure. He's killed before, but who knows why or how, or really even if he did it, officially.
He tugged on the leather strap holding the logs together, and it popped against itself as it pulled out of the clasp. Malik turned around and froze.
Ice stood silently, looking down at the shorter but much thicker man. His long fingers flicked against each other by his side, but otherwise he was completely still. Malik drew his scimitar and held it vertically between him and the mouthless creature. Neither of them spoke. Ice's deep black eyes stared at Malik, watching the gears turn and seeing him connect some dots. Malik swung the scimitar around above his head and swung it down to cleave Ice in two top to bottom, but Ice wasn't there. Ice had quickly stepped to the side, allowing the blade to swing down next to his left arm, ruffling his loose black sleeve as it whipped by. Malik's eyes widened at the figure's speed. He was in the blade's path one moment, and not the next. As Malik pulled the sword back toward him to strike again, Ice reached out and quickly grabbed the inner edge of the scimitar, resisting Malik's tugging. The lanky man twisted right, inward and towards Malik's body, forcing himself between the immobilized blade and the heavier man. Using his body as leverage, he wrenched the scimitar out of the grasp of his assailant and quickly took a long-legged step backwards, adjusting to hold the scimitar by his side. Malik took a step of his own backwards and raised his hands placatingly. Ice lifted the sword slightly and flicked it at Malik's waistline. The man looked down and pointed to Ice's dagger, which was tucked into his trousers, then looked back up at Ice to see him nod, his black eyes staring silently at the bearded bounty hunter. Malik, using only his forefinger and thumb, pulled the dagger out of his waistband, held it out with his arm to his side, and dropped it into the dirt where it stuck. Ice nodded, then turned and threw the scimitar up into the trees, with a flourish and the crossguard caught in a branch, suspending it 3 or 4 meters off the forest floor. Ice then calmly strode towards the fire pit, where Malik stood, causing him to tense, and watch pensively as the large figure closed the distance. When he reached him, however, he simply grabbed a log from the now unstrapped pile and dropped it onto the fire, which was dwindling. Without even looking at Malik, Ice moved to sit on the rock by the fire and put his lanky arms out to warm his hands. Perplexed and bewildered, Malik took a few steps back to stand on the other side of the fire from the apparent shapeshifter. For how else could Buggy have simply vanished? The small man-creature had said that there were no others at the site, and the tall man in front of him, if he could be called a man, had appeared in the same place Buggy was. Ice slowly looked up at Malik. His fingers flipped against each other. A single word suddenly echoed in Malik's head, the voice unfamiliar, a deep bass, scratchy and low.
Sit.
Malik, startled, almost couldn't help but obey, and he thudded down onto the dirty ground by the fire. Ice looked back at the fire and remained completely still, save for the flicking of his long fingers. Malik looked down at the fire for a moment, then glanced up at his sword, hanging from the tree a few meters away. When he looked back, he met Ice's eyes. Malik held the gaze for but a moment, then forced himself to look away. There was little capability for expression on the mouthless face, and nothing but inky blackness in the eyes. But still, the creature seemed sad, despondent. Both of the odd people Malik had met in that clearing had been wearing a set of loose-fitting black robes, befitting a monk, but unlike a monk's traditionally earthen-colored robes, these were much darker. Why black? Ice reached out and grabbed another log, laying it on the fire. 2 left. Malik cleared his throat and tried to speak with the mute figure.
Are you Buggy? Buggy said there were no others in these woods, and you're wearing the same clothes.
Ice shook his head and looked at his hands. His fingers flicked against each other. Malik tried again, assuming that the shaking of the head was a negative response to the figure and Buggy being the same person.
What happened to Buggy? He seemed kind.
Ice looked up at Malik, slowly lifted his head, and gently tapped his temple twice with his pointer finger. He then silently stood and walked over to the tent, where he knelt and began adjusting his sleeping mat. For even though the dawn had come, he decided to sleep since he hadn't slept at all the previous night. Malik, still feeling unsafe, looked around for potential weapons. The dagger he had taken from the site was gone, probably picked up by Ice at some point, who knows. His scimitar was hanging from a tree out of reach, or easy reach at least. He hadn't brought any extra weapons, which was a mistake he now realized. His eyes landed on the logs and the belt lying on the ground beneath them. Slowly, carefully he stood, his eyes on the tall figure that was now fumbling in the tent with a bag in the corner. Malik crept around the fire and knelt by the logs, gently lifting the first log off. The creature turned around. His eyes landed where Malik was before, then quickly flicked to where he crouched at the other end of the fire. Thinking quickly, Malik smiled at him and held up the log, then dropped it into the fire. The figure turned around to the end of the tent. The other log was rolled off, then he had his belt back. Taking each end in his hands, he slowly stood, then crept up behind the bald, limber man. Quickly, he dropped the middle of the belt in front of his face, yanked it back against his neck with a pop, closed his eyes, and pulled as hard as he could. "Ah!" screamed Scar as the pressure on his throat increased. Startled by the sound and the sudden appearance of a mop of black hair in his face, Malik released the belt, falling backward as nothing was resisting his force. Scar lunged forward and away from his assailant, groping in the tent. His hand landed on the rucksack, then he remembered. Lucius dropped the other dagger outside the tent. He glared over his shoulder at the shocked Malik who had stumbled to his feet. Scar, staying low, rushed the bounty hunter, driving his shoulder into the thicker man's stomach and knocking the wind out of him. Malik tried to grapple at the angry man's dark robes, but Scar scuttled backward too quickly. He danced out of the way of Malik's grasping arms, moving around the side of the tent and scooping the dagger off the ground. Malik, still without any weapons besides his belt, which was near useless in this case, raised his hands again.
"Who are you?"
he cried. Unclasping and flicking off the sheath in one smooth move, Scar brought his arm up and over, spinning the dagger into Malik's chest, sinking to the hilt and sending the bigger man to the leafy ground. Scar slowly walked up to Malik's gasping body and nudged his twitching foot with a black boot. "Buggy asked you if the man you're hunting is dangerous," he smiled. "If only you'd had the chance to find out." Scar turned his back to Malik and slowly walked away, adjusting his rumpled robes about his shoulders as he faded into the forest from Malik's sight.
Brick felt sick. Scar had killed a poor bounty hunter without even talking to him or anything, and now his dead body, surrounded by blood and small creatures, was sitting outside his tent. Brick liked the little birds, but felt sad they were eating a person. He was making a conscious effort to not let the shadow emanate from him so that they wouldn't fly away. Scar needs to stop killing people. He killed Dad, he killed that bar bouncer, he killed that man with the dog. That dog was nice. I liked the dog. I got to play with the dog later. Poor dog. Ice had to kill the dog because it was scared of him and it tried to bite him. Ice does have a scary face. I understand why the dog didn't feel safe. I need to move the body. Slowly, Brick stood and picked up the fat man, throwing him over his back. His large body was dead weight, and his blood was most surely staining his robes. Slowly, the big form lumbered out of the clearing,
carrying the body of the bounty hunter over his shoulder. A small starling cocked its head at the fading form, watching the blood-stained beard sway back and forth as the figure receded.